What if a single speech could change the course of history? Picture a moment when one person's words ignited the courage of thousands, turned the tide of war, or laid the foundation for an empire. These aren't just dramatic flourishes, they're real moments from ancient history, where speeches didn't just describe the world, but actively shaped it. Today, we're stepping back into the shadows of time to uncover the 25 most influential speeches ever delivered, words so potent they still resonate centuries later. This isn't just about memorizing famous lines, it's about understanding how language, when wielded with precision and passion, can alter destinies. Think about the last time someone's words moved you. Maybe a rousing pep talk, a heartfelt apology, or a call to action that made you see the world differently. Now multiply that impact by 1,000, and you'll start to grasp the power of the speeches we're about to explore. From the fiery orations of Athenian leaders rallying their city against invasion to the calculated pleas of Roman senators vying for power, these moments weren't just about persuasion. They were about survival, ambition, and the raw human desire to leave a mark on the world. And here's the astonishing part. Though these speeches were spoken millennia ago, their lessons about leadership, resilience, and the art of influence are just as relevant today. So why do these ancient words still matter? Because they reveal something fundamental about us, about how we communicate, how we inspire, and how we fight for what we believe in. Whether it's a general motivating his troops before a hopeless battle or a philosopher challenging the very fabric of society, these speeches remind us that ideas, when voiced with conviction, can outlast stone monuments and golden treasures. Over the course of this journey, we'll unpack the stories behind these legendary addresses, the people who delivered them, and the extraordinary circumstances that made their words immortal. By the end, you'll see how the echoes of ancient rhetoric still shape our world, and maybe even discover how to harness that power in your own life. Ready to begin? Let's step into history together. Let's begin with a speech that didn't just honor the dead, it defined an entire civilization. In the winter of 431 BCE, as Athens buried its fallen soldiers in the early days of the Peloponnesian War, Pericles stepped forward to deliver a eulogy that would echo through the ages. But this wasn't just a tribute to the dead. It was a bold declaration of what Athens stood for, a city where power belonged not to kings or tyrants but to its people. Imagine the scene: the Athenian public gathered in the shadow of the Acropolis, grieving their losses, and Pericles turns their sorrow into a rallying cry. He didn't just praise the fallen, he celebrated the ideals they died defending: freedom, equality, and the radical idea that every citizen had a voice. What made this speech revolutionary was its timing. Athens was at war with Sparta, a rival that embodied the opposite values: discipline, hierarchy, and militarism. Pericles' words were a direct challenge to that world. He called Athens the school of Greece, a place where debate and diversity weren't weaknesses but strengths. Think about that. In an era where most societies were ruled by force, he argued that a government by discussion, where even the poorest citizen could shape policy, was not just possible but superior. And here's the striking part: he tied those ideals directly to sacrifice. By framing democracy as something worth dying for, he transformed grief into purpose. But the real power of this speech lies in its legacy. 2,500 years later, when modern democracies invoke concepts like civic duty or the power of the people, they're channeling Pericles. His vision of a society where laws protect the weak and talent, not birthright, determined success still resonates. Leaders from Lincoln to Churchill have borrowed his language because he didn't just describe Athens, he gave the world a blueprint for what a free society could be. Yet there's a haunting irony here. Even as Pericles spoke, the war that would eventually crush Athens was just beginning. His speech was both a triumph and, in hindsight, a fleeting moment of hope before the storm. That's the paradox of great rhetoric. It can define an era, even as the world it describes slips away. Few speeches in history carry the weight of a man choosing death over dishonesty. In the spring of 399 BC, a 70-year-old philosopher named Socrates stood before an Athenian jury, accused of corrupting the young and disrespecting the gods. But what unfolded wasn't a plea for mercy, it was a masterclass in integrity. Picture the scene: 500 jurors packed into the courthouse, expecting the usual appeals and flattery. Instead, Socrates delivered a speech so defiant, it turned his trial into a defining moment for human thought. The unexamined life is not worth living, he declared, not as a poetic flourish, but as a challenge to every person in that room. He wasn't just defending himself, he was putting Athens itself on trial, forcing his listeners to confront their own fears of uncomfortable truths. What makes this speech extraordinary isn't just its courage, it's the razor-sharp logic behind it. When accused of teaching dangerous ideas, Socrates responded with a question. If he corrupted the youth, why did their families still seek his guidance? When told to stop philosophizing in exchange for leniency, he compared it to ordering a soldier to retreat from battle. His refusal to compromise wasn't stubbornness, it was a living demonstration of his belief that truth matters more than survival. And here's the twist: by condemning him to death, Athens unwittingly proved his point. The city that prided itself on free speech couldn't tolerate a man who asked too many questions. Yet Socrates' true victory lay in the aftermath. His student Plato immortalized the speech, ensuring its ideas would outlive the judges who sentenced him. Today, when scientists challenge dogma, when journalists hold power to account, they're walking the path Socrates carved. His speech endures because it's not about ancient gods or Athenian politics, it's about the universal struggle between comfort and truth. Every time someone risks their reputation to speak an unpopular fact, they're echoing that courtroom defiance. There's a reason this moment birthed Western philosophy. It forced humanity to choose between the safety of silence and the transformative power of asking, why? And though the hemlock silenced Socrates, his words still whisper to anyone who dares to think critically in the face of opposition. The tragedy, of course, is that Athens realized its mistake too late. Within years, the city erected a statue in Socrates' honor, a belated apology for executing its sharpest mind. But that's the paradox of great thinkers. They're rarely celebrated in their own time. What survives isn't the verdict of his trial, but the uncompromising ideals he voiced that day. That truth is worth pursuing even when it's inconvenient, and that a society afraid of questions is already dying. 24 centuries later, in classrooms and courtrooms worldwide, we're still learning that lesson. The next speech we'll explore takes us from philosophy to warfare, where another kind of courage would shape history. 324 years before the Common Era, on the banks of the Tigris River, an empire hung in the balance. Alexander the Great stood before his mutinous troops at Opis, Macedonian veterans who had marched with him across continents, now refusing to go further. This wasn't just a military crisis, it was the ultimate test of leadership. And what did Alexander do? He didn't draw his sword or issue threats, he told a story. With the dust of Persia still clinging to their armor, these soldiers had expected punishment. Instead, Alexander reminded them of every river they'd crossed together, every fortress they'd stormed, every impossible victory they'd snatched from the jaws of defeat. He listed their battles not as a commander reciting triumphs, but as a comrade recalling shared sacrifice. When you were hungry in the Hindu Kush, he said, I hungered with you. When you bled at Gaugamela, my blood soaked the same earth. This wasn't flattery, it was raw emotional alchemy. He transformed their rebellion into a moment of collective remembrance, making them see themselves not as disposable soldiers, but as irreplaceable architects of history. But here's what made this speech genius. Alexander didn't just appeal to nostalgia. He tied their past glory to a future only he could offer. By praising their endurance while hinting at greater conquests ahead, he gave them a choice: retire as heroes of yesterday, or march onward as legends in the making. And then, the masterstroke, he announced he'd send the discontented home with full honors. The moment his troops realized he was willing to let them go, their defiance crumbled. They begged to stay. That's the power of strategic vulnerability. By showing he valued their loyalty over their obedience, Alexander turned resentment back into devotion. Modern leaders still study this moment because it reveals a timeless truth. Authority flows not from titles, but from the ability to make people feel seen. When Texios rally their teams during crises or coaches revive the spirits of exhausted athletes, they're using Alexander's playbook, connecting individual effort to epic purpose. Yet there's a caution in this story too. Alexander's empire fractured soon after his death, proving that even the most charismatic rhetoric can't sustain systems built on one man's vision. His speech at Opis was both a triumph and a warning. Words can unite armies, but only enduring institutions outlive their speakers. The true lesson lies in what Alexander understood about human nature. People won't bleed for paychecks or empty slogans. They'll bleed for belonging, for the chance to be part of something grander than themselves. That's why his words still resonate. Whether you're leading a classroom, a startup, or a family, the principle holds. When you anchor your message in shared identity and audacious possibility, you don't just give orders, you ignite allegiance. And sometimes that's enough to turn the tide of history. Some promises are whispered in quiet moments but echo across centuries. Picture a 9-year-old boy standing in a Carthaginian temple, his small hand pressed against a sacrificial animal's still warm flesh. His father, the general Hamilcar Barca, leans down and asks one question: "Do you swear eternal enmity to Rome?" The boy doesn't hesitate. Hannibal's oath wasn't just a childhood pledge, it became the driving force behind one of history's most audacious military campaigns, a personal vendetta that would bring an empire to its knees. What makes this moment so extraordinary isn't just the scale of Hannibal's later achievements, marching elephants over the Alps, outmaneuvering Roman legions for 15 years, but the psychology behind it. This wasn't a general following orders or a king pursuing territory. Every battle Hannibal fought traced back to that temple vow, a promise so deeply internalized it functioned like destiny. Modern psychologists might call it an identity-defining commitment, where a single moment crystallizes a person's entire life path. And here's the chilling part: Rome likely never knew how deeply personal their worst nightmare truly was. The genius of Hannibal's campaign lay in its symbolic power. Crossing the Alps wasn't just a tactical maneuver, it was theater. Imagine the psychological impact on Rome when reports arrived of war elephants materializing like ghosts through mountain snows, led by a man who dedicated his existence to their ruin. His victories at Cannae and Trebia weren't merely military triumphs, they were chapters in a son's relentless promise-keeping. Even his eventual defeat couldn't erase the terror he'd seared into Roman consciousness. For generations afterward, Roman mothers would frighten misbehaving children with whispers of "Hannibal ad portas, Hannibal is at the gates." Yet there's a tragic irony woven through this story. The same oath that made Hannibal brilliant also blinded him. After crushing Rome's armies, he hesitated to march on the city itself, not from weakness, but because his vendetta required total humiliation, not quick conquest. That delay gave Rome time to recover. The boy who swore to destroy Rome ultimately ensured its resilience, proving how personal obsessions can distort even the sharpest strategic minds. Today, we see Hannibal's legacy in unexpected places. Entrepreneurs speak of burning the boats to commit to their ventures. Athletes visualize childhood dreams before championship games, all chasing that transformative moment when words become identity. But Hannibal's story also warns us, vows made in passion can outlive their purpose. His oath gave him focus but also trapped him in a cycle of conflict with no exit strategy. The next speech we examine reveals a very different kind of power, not vengeance but vision. Rome's fate hung by a thread on that November morning in 63 BCE. The Senate House buzzed with tension as Cicero, the consul with no noble blood, rose to face a man who embodied everything corrupt about the Republic. Catiline lounged nearby, his smirk barely concealing the coup already in motion. Secret arms caches, bribed officials, plans to burn the city. Then came 4 words that would slice through the chamber like a blade. How long, Catiline? With that razor-sharp question, Cicero didn't just accuse. He performed a political autopsy live before Rome's elite, peeling back layers of conspiracy with surgical precision. What made this speech revolutionary wasn't its anger, it was its calculated restraint. Cicero could have demanded Catiline's immediate arrest, risking civil war. Instead, he weaponized irony, addressing the conspirator as though he were an honored guest while methodically listing his crimes. "You were at the massacre last night," he noted casually, then pivoted to describe how Catiline's own followers had drunkenly confessed. Each detail landed like a hammer blow, not because Cicero shouted them, but because he let the absurdity speak for itself. The genius lay in making the Senate complicit when he asked, "How long will this madness mock us?" Every senator felt personally challenged to act. The speech's power came from its structure as much as its content. Cicero opened with rhetorical questions to unsettle his target, shifted to irrefutable evidence that cornered Catiline without room for denial, then crescendoed with an appeal to Rome's gods and ancestors. This wasn't just oratory, it was psychological warfare. By the time Cicero finished, Catiline's allies were edging away from him on the benches, their loyalty crumbling under the weight of exposure. Within hours, the would-be dictator fled Rome in disgrace, his plot unraveled without a single sword drawn. Yet the real lesson here transcends ancient politics. Cicero proved that words, when sharpened by truth and timing, can be deadlier than armies. Modern whistleblowers and investigative journalists employ this same tactic, presenting facts so methodically that denial becomes impossible. But there's a darker side to this triumph. Cicero's victory sowed the seeds of his own downfall. His later exile proved that exposing corruption doesn't eliminate its roots. The speech remains a masterclass in crisis leadership, reminding us that saving institutions requires more than brilliant rhetoric. It demands rebuilding the systems that allowed betrayal to fester. What endures is Cicero's blueprint for dismantling threats through sheer clarity. Whether in boardrooms uncovering fraud or communities confronting injustice, his approach still works. Isolate the guilty with facts, mobilize the hesitant through shared outrage, and let the weight of truth do the heavy lifting. That's why 2,000 years later, How Long, Catiline isn't just a historical artifact, it's a playbook for anyone who must speak truth to power without flinching. History remembers Cleopatra as the woman who captivated 2 of Rome's most powerful men. but reduce her to just a seductress and you miss the real genius behind her legend. When she first met Mark Antony at Tarsus in 41 BC, she didn't arrive with whispered sweet nothings. She staged a spectacle so bold it redefined political theater. Picture the Cydnus River glowing with torches as her golden barge glided into view, its purple sails billowing, the queen herself dressed as Venus surrounded by attendants playing the roles of Cupids. This wasn't flirtation, it was psychological warfare wrapped in mythology. But the true mastery came later, in private councils where she traded costumes for something far more potent. A vision of empire that made Antony believe ruling the world together wasn't just possible, it was inevitable. What set Cleopatra apart wasn't her ability to beguile, but her strategic framing of their alliance. While Roman women were barred from politics, she spoke to Antony as an equal, blending flattery with geopolitical savvy. Imagine, she might have said, your legions and my treasure united not as conqueror and subject, but as partners reshaping civilization. She anchored her appeals in his deepest insecurities, his rivalry with Octavian, his hunger for military glory beyond Caesar's shadow. Every word served dual purposes: romantic devotion intertwined with tactical advantage. When she convinced him to abandon Rome for Alexandria, it wasn't surrender to passion. It was the calculated move of a ruler who understood that influence flows through personal bonds as much as treaties. The brilliance of Cleopatra's rhetoric lay in its adaptability. As Antony's fortunes wavered, she reframed their narrative no longer just lovers, but living gods destined to rule. Their staged donations of Alexandria ceremony, where they sat on golden thrones distributing kingdoms to their children, was speech made spectacle. By casting their union as divinely ordained, she made resistance to their power seem like sacrilege. Even in their final days, as Octavian's forces closed in, her language shifted again, from imperial ambition to tragic defiance. "You will not take me alive to adorn some Roman triumph," she essentially declared, turning inevitable defeat into a controlled narrative of immortal love. Modern leaders still study this interplay of intimacy and strategy. When diplomats cultivate chemistry with counterparts or CEOs personalize shareholder appeals, they're employing Cleopatra's playbook, understanding that persuasion lives in the space between logic and emotion. Yet her story also carries a warning. When personal and political agendas become indistinguishable, the fallout is catastrophic. Antony lost Rome because he couldn't separate lover from strategist, while Cleopatra underestimated how their partnership would unite Rome against them. The most enduring lesson isn't about manipulation, it's about the double-edged nature of shared dreams. Vision can bind people together, but when two ambitions merge completely, sometimes the only escape is a serpent's bite. What survives is the revelation that power isn't just taken, it's co-authored. Cleopatra's speeches to Antony remind us that the most transformative alliances aren't transactions, but stories people choose to believe in together. And sometimes those stories outlive the kingdoms they were meant to build. Sometimes the most powerful speeches aren't speeches at all, just 3 words scribbled in haste. When Julius Caesar dashed off Veni, Vidi, Vici after his lightning victory over Pharnaces in 47 BC, he wasn't trying to craft a timeless motto. He was simply reporting facts. I came, I saw, I conquered. Yet those 6 syllables did more than summarize a battle. They became the ancient world's most enduring lesson in the art of persuasion through restraint. What makes this phrase so extraordinary isn't just its brevity, it's the audacity behind it. Caesar had every reason to gloat. Pharnaces, son of Rome's notorious enemy Mithridates, had exploited civil war to reclaim his father's land. The Senate expected a prolonged campaign, but Caesar smashed the rebel army in under a week. most generals would have sent a lengthy dispatch detailing their brilliance. Caesar, he reduced triumph to its essence, trusting the facts to speak for themselves. That's where the real power lies, in the unspoken swagger between the lines. The message wasn't just "I won," it was "this wasn't even difficult." Modern communication experts would call this high signal, low noise. In an era where politicians filibuster and advertisers bombard us with slogans, Caesar's three-part structure cuts through the clutter like a sword stroke. Each word builds momentum, arrival signals intent, observation demonstrates strategy, victory confirms inevitability. It's a narrative arc distilled to its purest form, mirroring the relentless efficiency of his campaign. The genius is in what's omitted: no casualty figures, no tactical diagrams, just the irreducible core of human achievement, action, assessment, triumph. But here's the twist: this wasn't just battlefield bravado. Caesar was also playing domestic politics. By the time his note reached Rome, the city was buzzing with rumors of his potential overthrow. Veni, Vidi, Vici served as both victory announcement and veiled threat, a reminder that the man who just dismantled an army in days could just as swiftly handle his rivals at home. The phrase worked because it was adaptable, a boast to allies, a warning to enemies, and a propaganda soundbite all at once. Today, we see Caesar's legacy everywhere, from corporate taglines to viral tweets. Elon Musk's "the rumor is false" tweet that boosted Tesla stock, or Churchill's "action this day" memos echo the same principle: clarity conquers. Yet there's a caution here too. For every CEO who inspires with concise vision, there are 100 who mistake brevity for substance. Caesar's words carried weight because his deeds backed them. Without the swift, brutal victory at Zela, Veni, Vidi, Vici would have been empty bluster. That's the eternal lesson: whether you're leading legions or launching startups, the power of few words depends entirely on the weight of many actions. The phrase endures because it taps into something primal about human psychology. We're wired to respect efficiency, to admire those who can compress chaos into order. When a surgeon says "scalpel, clamp, suture," or a firefighter barks "location, rescue, clear," they're channeling Caesar's ethos, but perhaps its deepest resonance lies in its democratic appeal. You don't need an empire to apply this principle. Anyone can adopt the discipline of distillation, the student condensing a thesis into one piercing sentence, the parent summarizing life's lesson in a bedtime story, the activist crafting a chant that rallies millions. Greatness isn't always about saying more. Sometimes it's about finding the three words that say it all. Caesar's triumph reminds us that in a world drowning in words, the sharpest blades are honed from simplicity. The next speech we explore takes us from the battlefield to the Senate floor, where another Roman would prove that words, even without swords, could shake the foundations of power. Flames licked the sky over Londinium in the year 60 as a woman draped in Celtic gold raised her spear before thousands. Boudica's voice cut through the smoke, not with the polished rhetoric of Roman senators, but with the raw fury of a mother wronged. "Win or die, that is my resolve," she declared, and in that moment a rebellion became legend. But this wasn't just a battle cry, it was the culmination of unspeakable outrage. The Romans had flogged her publicly, violated her daughters, and seized her late husband's kingdom. What followed wasn't merely war, it was a reckoning. What made Boudica's speech so devastatingly effective was its perfect alignment of personal pain and collective purpose. She didn't just list Roman atrocities, she transformed them into a shared wound. "Look how they treat your queens," she thundered. "Now imagine what they'll do to your wives, your children." This wasn't abstract politics, it was survival made visceral. By tying Rome's crimes against her family to every tribesman's future, She turned individual vengeance into a cultural uprising. The genius lay in her framing. This wasn't a reckless revolt, but the only honorable response to existential threat. The speech's power also flowed from its cultural authenticity. Unlike Roman orators relying on structured logic, Boudica channeled the Celtic tradition of prophetic rage, the same fervor that inspired druids to curse their enemies. Her words carried echoes of warrior queens from tribal lore, making resistance feel inevitable rather than impossible. When she promised victory or a death that will echo through time, she wasn't offering false hope. She was invoking the Celtic belief that glorious defeat outlives cowardly surrender. This cultural resonance turned farmers into warriors overnight. Yet for all its primal force, Boudica's rhetoric had chilling precision. She didn't just rally her people, she weaponized Roman stereotypes against them. Knowing Rome saw Celts as irrational barbarians, she leaned into that image, encouraging acts so brutal they'd paralyze the enemy with terror. Burning Londinium wasn't just tactical, it was psychological theater proving Rome wasn't invincible. Modern movements still study this approach, from suffragettes smashing windows to activists staging dramatic sit-ins. The lesson: when the powerful dismiss you as emotional, sometimes leaning into that perception becomes your sharpest tool. The tragedy, of course, is that Boudica's brilliance couldn't overcome Roman discipline. After initial victories, her forces were crushed, and she took poison rather than face capture. But here's why her speech endures. It crystallizes the moment when oppression sparks something unstoppable. From Joan of Arc to Ukrainian resistance leaders, those who channel collective grievance into defiant action walk in Boudica's footsteps. Her words remind us that the most potent rhetoric isn't always polished. Sometimes it's the roar of someone with nothing left to lose, turning pain into a weapon that outlasts empires. Imagine writing your own eulogy, not as others might see you, but exactly as you wish to be remembered. That's precisely what Emperor Augustus did with his Res Gesti, a posthumous autobiography so meticulously crafted, it turned history itself into his personal monument. Chiseled onto bronze pillars across the empire after his death in 14 CE, this wasn't just a record of achievements. It was the ancient world's most brilliant exercise in legacy building. Augustus didn't just rule Rome, he scripted its memory of him, ensuring that centuries later, we'd still see his reign through his own gilded lens. What makes the Res Gesti fascinating isn't its factual accuracy, but its strategic omissions. The man who emerged from civil war as Rome's sole ruler never mentions his rivals' names. No Mark Antony, no Cleopatra, just vague references to tyranny overcome. He downplays his military conquests while emphasizing civic projects. Aqueducts repaired, gladiatorial games funded, the city found in brick and left in marble. This was spin doctoring at its most sophisticated, turning autocracy into benevolence by focusing on bread and circuses rather than blood and iron. Modern politicians still use this playbook, highlighting infrastructure while glossing over controversies, but Augustus did it with an emperor's flair for spectacle. The document's genius lies in its tone. Written in first person yet devoid of personal anecdotes, it feels both intimate and deliberately impersonal. Augustus lists achievements like a balance sheet. I restored 82 temples. I gave 300 sesterces to every citizen. There's no introspection, no vulnerability, just an immutable record of deeds meant to transmute power into permanence. By avoiding poetic flourishes, he made propaganda feel like plain accounting, as if his version of history were as undeniable as tax records. Even today, when corporations issue annual reports or governments publish progress metrics, they're channeling Augustus' illusion of objectivity. Yet the Res Gesti also reveals a deeper anxiety. Beneath its marble-cool prose pulses a fear familiar to any leader. That legacy is fragile. Augustus knew his peace could unravel, his reforms could be reversed. So he planted his narrative in stone, literally, ensuring that even if future emperors failed, his ideal image would endure, and it worked. While Nero's name became synonymous with decadence and Caligula's with madness, Augustus' reputation as the wise founder persisted. That's the ultimate power move, not just shaping your era, but rigging the judgment of posterity. The lesson for modern leaders is clear, if unsettling. Control the story, and you control how history breathes life into your deeds long after you're gone. From CEOs writing memoirs to influencers curating social media feeds, the urge to self-mythologize is timeless. But Augustus' example carries a warning too. When image outweighs substance, even the grandest monuments become hollow. The next speech we explore flips this script entirely, not a ruler crafting his legacy, but a slave challenging an empire's conscience. The scorching Corinthian sun beat down on two men whose worldviews couldn't have been farther apart: Alexander the Great, conqueror of continents, and Diogenes, the philosopher who owned nothing but a wooden bowl. Until he saw a child drinking from his hands and threw even that away. When Alexander, fresh from his Persian victories, approached the barrel-dwelling sage with an offer to grant any request, the moment crackled with possibility. Kings and generals had begged for Alexander's favor, yet here was Diogenes barely glancing up from the dirt where he sat. "Stop blocking my son," he muttered. 4 words that sliced through imperial grandeur like a blade through silk. This wasn't just a snarky retort, it was a masterclass in philosophical jujitsu. By treating history's most powerful man as a literal obstruction, Diogenes exposed the fragility of conventional power. Alexander's armies could storm cities, but they couldn't command sunlight. His treasure rooms overflowed with gold, yet here was a man who'd voluntarily chosen poverty, proving that real freedom comes from needing nothing. The brilliance of Diogenes' challenge lay in its inversion of hierarchy. The emperor became a nuisance, while the beggar retained ultimate sovereignty over his own happiness. What makes this exchange timeless is the reaction that followed. Instead of executing the insolent philosopher, as Persian kings certainly would have, Alexander reportedly sighed, "If I were not Alexander, I would wish to be Diogenes." That's the moment the speech transcends cheeky banter and becomes profound. The conqueror recognized something his tutors had failed to teach him: that true power isn't about controlling geography, but mastering one's own desires. Diogenes, by embodying radical self-sufficiency, had achieved something Alexander's armies never could: complete independence from external validation. Modern psychology echoes this ancient clash. Studies on happiness consistently show that beyond basic needs, wealth and status contribute little to life satisfaction, a truth Diogenes demonstrated daily by living in a jar and mocking social conventions. His rebuke to Alexander anticipates modern minimalism, the enoughness movement, and even tech billionaires' recent fascination with austerity. But there's a crucial distinction. Diogenes wasn't preaching self-denial as a productivity hack. His philosophy was about exposure, stripping away illusions to reveal life's raw essentials. When he told Alexander to move, he was really saying, "Your empire is a distraction from the only things that matter: air, light, the present moment." The encounter's enduring relevance lies in its duality. For ambitious souls, it's a cautionary tale about the hollow core of achievement. For seekers of meaning, it's a manifesto for intentional living. Yet Diogenes would likely scoff at his own glorification. His entire ethos rejected reverence, making him the ultimate anti-guru. That's why this speech, if you can call it that, stands apart from others on our list. No grand rhetoric, no polished arguments, just a naked truth, sometimes literally, as Diogenes was known to shed his clothes that topples empires of pretense with a single sentence. Perhaps the deepest lesson here is about audience. Most speeches aim to persuade crowds, but Diogenes' words were tailored for one listener, the one man who thought he had everything, only to discover he might be poorer than the guy sleeping in a barrel. Their exchange proves that influence doesn't require eloquence or even agreement sometimes. It just takes the courage to tell the most powerful person in the room they're standing in your light. The marble benches of Athens' assembly were never meant for comfort. They were designed to keep men alert during debates that decided fates. And in the 4th century BCE, one voice cut through the drowsy heat with such urgency, his very name became synonymous with warning. Demosthenes didn't just speak against Philip of Macedon, he weaponized language to fracture the complacency cloaking Athens. His Philippics, those blistering speeches that gave us the term for political invective, weren't merely criticism. They were a diagnostic of tyranny's early symptoms, delivered while the patient still had time to act. What set these speeches apart was their forensic precision. While others dismissed Philip as a distant nuisance, Demosthenes dissected his tactics like a surgeon mapping cancer. The incremental land grabs disguised as diplomacy, the bribes fracturing Greek unity, the calculated delays that lulled cities into false security. He doesn't conquer with armies first, Demosthenes thundered. He conquers with your indifference. This wasn't hyperbole, it was a playbook modern autocrats still follow. By framing Philip's expansion not as sudden aggression but as a series of uncontested small steps, he exposed how democracies sleepwalk into subjugation. The tragedy of the Philippics lies in their prescience. Demosthenes catalogued Philip's maneuvers with such accuracy that reading them today feels eerily contemporary. The way strongmen test boundaries, exploit divisions, and recast aggression as defensive necessity. His 3rd Philippic remains a masterclass in strategic alarm. When will you act, when he's at your walls, or when you still have allies to stand with you? That question haunts every generation that mistakes temporary comfort for lasting safety. Athens, addicted to theater and festivals, dismissed him as a fearmonger until Macedonian phalanxes stood at Thermopylae. Yet Demosthenes' true legacy isn't in his failure to save Athens. It's in how he redefined resistance. Before him, orators debated abstract ideals. He grounded warnings in actionable specifics, which ports needed garrisons, which treaties required renewal, exactly how much silver should fund defenses. Modern whistleblowers and investigative journalists inherit this tradition, the unpopular voices who quantify risks before disaster strikes, the chilling parallel. Societies still reward such voices with exile or ignore them until crisis hits. What makes these speeches endure isn't just their historical impact, but their psychological insight. Demosthenes understood that tyranny thrives on distraction, on citizens too busy with daily bread to notice their freedoms baking slower each day. His solution wasn't just outrage, but what we'd now call civic muscle memory, constant vigilance exercised through participation. A democracy's strength, he argued, isn't in its walls but in its citizens' willingness to stand watch. That lesson transcends eras, from Cold War bunker drills to modern cybersecurity alerts. The bitter irony, the man who warned against foreign domination ultimately took his own life to avoid Macedonian capture. Yet in a final twist of fate, Demosthenes' words outlived Philip's empire. Centuries later, when Cicero penned his attacks on Mark Antony, he consciously modeled them on the Philippics, proving that ideas birthed in one crisis can arm another. Today, when journalists spotlight creeping authoritarianism or activists rally against normalized corruption, they channel Demosthenes' unglamorous truth. freedom survives only when someone's willing to name the threat while laughter still echoes in the agora. His speeches stand as both triumph and caution. Triumph because they birthed a template for dissent. Caution because they remind us that warnings alone don't change outcomes. Action does. The next speech in our journey shifts from political defiance to spiritual revelation, where another voice would challenge not an empire, but the cosmos itself. The golden pavilions of Persia's war camp shimmered under the Aegean sun as Xerxes, ruler of the largest empire the world had ever seen, prepared to address his commanders. Before him lay the narrow pass of Thermopylae, and blocking it, a tiny force of Spartans who dared defy his million-strong army. His laughter echoed across the royal tent as he mocked their hubris. What fools these Greeks are! Do they truly believe a handful of men can halt the tide of history? This wasn't just a battle speech, it was the moment absolute power met unshakable principle, and the collision would echo through eternity. Xerxes' words dripped with imperial certainty. He promised his generals that Spartan arrows would darken the sky only to be met with the legendary retort, "Then we shall fight in the shade." His speech assumed sheer numbers guaranteed victory, a calculus that had never failed him before. But here's what he fatally misunderstood. Resolve isn't measured in head counts. The Spartans weren't just defending territory. They were upholding a code where death with honor outweighed life in submission. By framing resistance as absurd rather than admirable, Xerxes revealed the blind spot of unchecked power, the inability to recognize that some values dwarf even conquest. The speech's tragic irony lies in its aftermath. For 3 days, 300 Spartans and their allies turned Thermopylae into a slaughterhouse, their phalanx carving through wave after wave of Persian troops. Each fallen Spartan took dozens with him, proving that terrain and discipline could negate numerical advantage. Xerxes' earlier boasts about crushing ants beneath his sandal now rang hollow. His ants were costing him entire regiments. The lesson wasn't just tactical, it was psychological. The king who'd ordered the sea whipped for disobedience now faced men who bowed to nothing, not even the certainty of annihilation. Modern leaders still grapple with this parable. When corporations dismiss startups as insignificant or superpowers underestimate guerrilla resistance, they're replaying Xerxes' fatal miscalculation. His speech epitomizes the danger of conflating size with strength, a mistake repeated from Napoleon's march into Russia to tech giants ignoring disruptive innovators. The Spartans knew something Xerxes never learned. That leverage lies not in how much you have, but how you use what little you hold. Yet there's deeper wisdom here about the nature of defiance. The Spartan stand wasn't just effective, it was catalytic. Their sacrifice became legend, igniting Greek resistance that ultimately shattered Persian ambitions. Xerxes won the pass but lost the narrative, a cautionary tale for any leader who thinks victory is measured in ground taken rather than spirits unbroken. Today, when underdog movements from civil rights to environmental activism punch above their weight, they channel the Thermopylae principle that the right cause fought with enough conviction can turn apparent suicide into strategic triumph. The speech endures not for its eloquence but for its spectacular failure to grasp reality. Xerxes assumed history belonged to the mighty. Leonidas proved it belongs to the unwavering. Their clash reminds us that the most dangerous arrogance isn't believing you're strong, it's forgetting why others might be stronger. The dust settled over Zama in 202 BCE, but the real test of Rome's character was just beginning. Scipio Africanus, the general who'd finally outmaneuvered Hannibal, stood before the shattered remnants of Carthage's leadership with a choice that would redefine victory itself. He could have demanded their complete obliteration, razing the city to the ground as Rome's vengeful senators urged. Instead, he offered terms so measured they stunned both allies and enemies. Surrender your warships, pay modest reparations, and live. This wasn't weakness, it was strategic brilliance disguised as mercy. What made Scipio's ultimatum revolutionary wasn't just its leniency, it was its psychological acuity. He understood that crushing Carthage completely would create a power vacuum, inviting new threats to rise. But by leaving them humbled yet intact, he turned a bitter enemy into a dependent ally. His terms included a brilliant stipulation. Carthage could defend itself but never wage offensive war without Rome's consent. This wasn't just peacekeeping, it was institutionalized restraint, ensuring Carthage would buffer Rome against other African powers while remaining too weak to rebel. Modern peace treaties from post-war Japan to European Union agreements still follow this blueprint, defanging adversaries without breeding generations of resentment. The speech's power came from its duality. To Carthaginians, Scipio framed the terms as honorable survival. Keep your homes, your temples, your way of life, just not your empire. To Romans, he sold it as calculated dominance. Why bear the cost of occupying burnt ruins when we can profit from their trade? This two-tiered persuasion revealed his mastery of geopolitical theater. Unlike Alexander's flashy conquests or Caesar's bloody triumphs, Scipio's victory was designed to look generous while being ruthlessly pragmatic. His terms allowed Rome to claim moral high ground while tightening invisible chains, a diplomatic sleight of hand that future empires would mimic for centuries. Yet the true measure of this speech lies in its ripple effects. By sparing Carthage, Scipio set a precedent that would elevate Rome from a regional power to a Mediterranean hegemon. Subsequent generations of Roman commanders, Pompey, Caesar, Augustus, would emulate his blend of military might and strategic restraint. Even the American Marshall Plan after World War II echoes Scipio's insight that rebuilding defeated enemies can be smarter than destroying them. But there's a tragic footnote. 50 years later, hardliners in Rome would ignore Scipio's wisdom, provoking the Third Punic War and salt-soiling Carthage's ashes. The very stability he'd engineered collapsed when short-term vengeance overshadowed long-term vision. Scipio's ultimatum endures as a masterclass in the art of victory. Not the reckless glory of total conquest, but the patient architecture of sustainable power. When modern leaders negotiate corporate mergers or international treaties, they're wrestling with the same balance he struck between asserting dominance and preserving future possibilities. His speech proves that the shrewdest conquerors don't just win battles, they design the peace that follows. And sometimes, the most enduring victories are those where both sides walk away believing they've salvaged something precious. The library's marble halls once echoed with debates about geometry and the stars, but on that March morning in 415, the air smelled of charred parchment and fear. Hypatia stood before her students not as Alexandria's greatest scholar, but as the last guardian of a vanishing ideal. That truth belongs to reason, not mobs. The city outside seethed with religious riots. Bishops and zealots had turned philosophy into heresy. Yet when her inner circle begged her to flee, she adjusted her philosopher's cloak and delivered a final lesson more potent than any equation. They can burn books, she said, tracing a perfect circle in the dust, but never the fact that this contains the universe. What made Hypatia's last lecture revolutionary wasn't its content. She'd spent decades teaching mathematics and astronomy, but its unshakable context. As Christian fanatics demonized her as a pagan witch, she refused to abandon the foundational principle of Greek thought, that the world operates by discoverable laws, not divine whim. Her chalk diagrams of planetary motion became acts of defiance, proving that knowledge doesn't kneel to dogma. Modern scientists facing censorship from Galileo to climate researchers, walk in her footsteps when they present data that challenges orthodoxy. The tragic brilliance of her stance, she knew the violence coming. Her lecture wasn't hopeful, it was archival, planting seeds of logic in minds that might outlive the storm. The speech's power came from its layered meanings. On one level, she taught celestial mechanics, how planets orbit in ellipses. On another, she modeled intellectual courage, showing that real scholarship isn't about having answers, but preserving the right to ask questions. When she demonstrated Archimedes' principle of buoyancy by floating a wooden model ship in a water basin, she wasn't just explaining physics, she was illustrating how ideas, no matter how suppressed, always resurface. This visual metaphor would haunt her students later as they watched Christian mobs dump Alexandria's library scrolls into the sea. Yet Hypatia's true foresight lay in anticipating the Dark Ages centuries early. Her warnings about thinking with the gut instead of the brain predicted the medieval shift from inquiry to credulity. The most chilling part, her murder by a Christian mob, dragged through streets flayed with pottery shards, wasn't just personal, it was symbolic. The killers didn't just destroy a woman, they sought to erase her worldview. That's why her last lecture matters today, as misinformation surges and experts face growing hostility. She represents every teacher who's ever been silenced for inconvenient truths, from Soviet geneticists to modern educators banned from mentioning evolution. What endures isn't just her martyrdom, but her method. Hypatia didn't counter fanaticism with anger, but with irrefutable elegance, a star chart, a geometric proof, the calm repetition of observe and verify. In an era where algorithms reward outrage, her disciplined rationality feels almost radical. When whistleblowers leak documents or journalists fact-check dictators, they're honoring her belief that knowledge, however besieged, is the ultimate resistance. The circle she drew in the dust that final day wasn't just a shape, it was a boundary no tyranny can ever fully cross. The space where human reason insists against all odds that 2 + 2 must always equal 4. The Roman Forum crackled with tension as Tiberius Gracchus climbed the rostrum, his hand gripping a scroll that would send shockwaves through the Republic. It wasn't just parchment he held, it was a lit fuse. The year was 133 BCE, and Rome's gleaming temples masked a festering wound. Soldiers returning from wars found their family farms seized by wealthy patricians, their livelihoods swallowed by vast slave-worked estates. Gracchus' voice cut through the aristocratic murmurs like a plow through fallow ground. "You call yourselves Romans," he challenged the Senate, "while the men who bled for this republic starve on land that rightfully belongs to them." What made Gracchus' speeches explosive wasn't just their content, it was their timing. Rome's military machine depended on farmer soldiers, but those very men were being pushed into destitution. His proposed land reforms weren't radical economic theory, they were survival measures wrapped in patriotic appeal. How can we ask men to defend lands they no longer own? He demanded, framing redistribution not as charity but as national security. This rhetorical pivot was masterful. By tying soldiers' welfare to Rome's strength, he turned a class issue into a civic duty. Modern politicians still use this tactic when linking social programs to broader stability, but Gracchus did it with a rawness that bypassed intellectual debate and struck straight at Roman identity. The true brilliance of his rhetoric lay in its visual theater. During one speech, he brought forward veterans missing limbs, their hollow cheeks testifying to their plight. "These hands built your villas," he thundered, "and now they beg outside them." Such staging transformed statistics into human drama, making abstract inequality viscerally real. When opponents accused him of populism, he countered with Rome's founding myth. that Romulus himself had divided land equally. This wasn't revolution, it was restoration of ancient values. The patricians' horror grew as Gracchus bypassed Senate approval, taking his case directly to the People's Assembly, a move as unprecedented as a modern president ruling by Twitter poll. Yet Gracchus' speeches carried a fatal paradox. His calls for fairness exposed how brittle Rome's power structures really were. By revealing that the Senate would rather murder reformers than share an acre, he demonstrated that the Republic's ideals were already dead. When aristocratic thugs clubbed him to death on the Capitol steps, they didn't just kill a man, they proved his argument. The spilled blood of the people's champion stained the very cobblestones where he'd spoken, creating a martyr whose legacy would fuel the populist fires of Marius Caesar and eventually the empire's collapse. Today, Gracchus' struggle resonates wherever wealth concentrates while workers lose ground. From labor union speeches to progressive tax reform debates, the core tension remains: how much inequality can a society bear before it fractures? His story warns us that when rhetoric alone can't bridge the gap between privilege and justice, violence often fills the void. The tragedy and the lesson is that Rome might have survived its own golden age had it listened to Gracchus' warnings instead of silencing them. But revolutions aren't sparked by reasonable men, and sometimes the most dangerous thing a speaker can do is tell the truth too loudly. Babylon's gates swung open in 539 BC, not to the crash of battering rams, but to the murmurs of awestruck crowds. Cyrus the Great didn't just conquer the city, he redefined what victory could mean. As the Persian king entered Babylon's towering Ishtar Gate, he carried no torch, drew no sword. Instead, his scribes unrolled a proclamation that would echo across millennia. The Cyrus cylinder, a humble clay barrel etched with words so revolutionary, modern scholars call it humanity's first Bill of Rights. What set this declaration apart wasn't just its content. Though freeing enslaved peoples and endorsing religious freedom were radical enough, but its underlying philosophy. Where other conquerors boasted of crushed enemies and plundered temples, Cyrus framed his rule as benevolent stewardship. "I returned the gods to their sanctuaries," the cylinder reads, "and let all peoples live as they wished." This wasn't empty propaganda. Archaeological evidence shows he repatriated Jewish exiles, funded rebuilding their temple, and even restored displaced populations to their homelands. The genius lay in recognizing that durable empires aren't built on fear, but on the gratitude of those who flourish under them. The cylinder's true brilliance emerges in its psychological acumen. Cyrus didn't impose Persian culture. He positioned himself as the restorer of local traditions disrupted by Babylon's previous rulers. By casting his invasion as liberation rather than conquest, he turned resentment into loyalty overnight. Modern nation builders from Napoleon to post-war reconstruction planners have attempted similar reframing, but Cyrus did it with unprecedented finesse. His declaration worked because it wasn't just words. It matched actions, allowing diverse cultures to thrive under Persian oversight while maintaining the empire's cohesion. Yet the most striking aspect of this artifact is its accidental immortality. Cyrus likely intended the cylinder as routine administrative documentation, buried in a temple's foundations like a Mesopotamian time capsule. That it survived at all is a quirk of history, unearthed millennia later by British archaeologists. Today, when the United Nations displays a replica as an early symbol of human rights, or when Iranian diplomats cite it as proof of their nation's historic tolerance, they're engaging in the same reinterpretation Cyrus mastered, using the past to shape contemporary identity. The cylinder's legacy lies in its demonstration that power, when paired with principle, can outlast its creators. From the Magna Carta to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, every foundational document owes something to that baked clay tube. But there's a caution here too. Ideals inscribed don't automatically translate into realities lived. Cyrus' successors often betrayed his vision, proving that noble words require constant guardianship. That tension between aspiration and implementation still defines every society struggling to live up to its own highest proclamations. Perhaps the deepest lesson isn't in the text itself, but in its mere existence. Before Cyrus, victory monuments listed subdued enemies and stolen treasures. After him, the paradigm shifted. Rulers began competing not just in might, but in magnanimity. The cylinder reminds us that the most enduring conquests aren't of land, but of imagination, when the vanquished start believing their conqueror's story. And sometimes all it takes to change history is one leader willing to put that story in writing. Molten sunlight glinted off spear points as the Persian envoy's shadow stretched across the hot gates. His demand carried the weight of an empire. Lay down your weapons and King Xerxes will grant you mercy. The Spartan king didn't even turn his head. Leonidas' reply, "Come and take them," wasn't just defiance, it was physics. 3 words that transformed geography into destiny, proving that some passes aren't measured in miles, but in the space between courage and fear. What makes this moment timeless isn't the brevity. Those Spartans perfected the art of laconic speech, but the layered strategy behind it. Leonidas knew Persian psychology hinged on spectacle. Their empire thrived on the theater of overwhelming force. By reducing his refusal to a casual challenge, he flipped the script. This wasn't a king addressing an emperor, but a warrior inviting a brawl. The genius lay in its simplicity. Sparta's entire philosophy boiled down to 4 syllables. No grand speeches about freedom, no poetic vows, just the unshakable certainty that some lines won't be crossed without paying in blood. Modern militaries still study the ripple effects of that exchange. When Ukrainian soldiers told a Russian warship, "Go fuck yourselves," on Snake Island, they weren't just channeling Spartan spirit, they were weaponizing the same principle. Psychological warfare isn't about matching force, it's about reframing the terms of engagement. Leonidas turned an ultimatum into a dare, forcing Xerxes to either back down or prove his might against 300 men. Either outcome served Sparta humiliating Persia or revealing their vulnerability. Yet the deeper resonance lies in how those words transcend warfare. Every time a whistleblower refuses to delete files, an activist stands firm before riot police, or a child says no to a bully, they're speaking in Leonidas' shadow. His phrase distilled a universal truth. Real power isn't in taking what you want, but in holding what's yours. The Persian army could trample crops, burn cities, even kill every Spartan at Thermopylae, but they could never compel obedience. That distinction between destruction and domination still defines resistance movements today. The irony, Leonidas probably never expected his words to survive him. Spartans viewed glory as a byproduct of duty, not an end goal. But in refusing to perform submission, he gave history something more valuable than victory, a template for how the seemingly powerless can strip emperors of their illusions. When protesters in Tiananmen Square faced tanks with nothing but their bodies, or when doctors in pandemic wards kept working despite dwindling supplies, they proved that Thermopylae wasn't just a battle. It was the moment humanity learned that some no-s echo forever. Athens in the 5th century BCE was a city of roaring debates and thundering orators, yet the most influential voice in Pericles' circle never addressed the assembly. Aspasia of Miletus, a foreign-born woman barred from public life, reportedly shaped the speeches that defined Athenian democracy. While Pericles stood on the Pnyx addressing thousands, Historians whisper that the words flowing from his mouth bore her fingerprints. This wasn't just a romantic partnership, it was an intellectual collaboration that blurred the lines between private counsel and public policy. Imagine the scene, Pericles returning from the agora, recounting the day's debates, while Aspasia, educated in philosophy and rhetoric, offered counterarguments refined over wine and lamplight. Her influence wasn't hidden so much as rendered invisible by a society that refused to acknowledge women as political beings. What makes Aspasia's story revolutionary isn't just the possibility that she authored portions of the funeral oration. Though the speech's unconventional emphasis on women's civic role suggests a perspective alien to typical Athenian rhetoric. It's the larger question her existence forces us to confront. How many brilliant minds were erased simply because their voices couldn't legally be heard? Contemporary sources like Plato and Plutarch hint at her role, with Socrates himself joking that he learned rhetoric from Aspasia. These crumbs of evidence suggest a woman who didn't just inspire great speeches, but actively crafted their most radical ideas. When Pericles declared Athens the school of Greece, was he channeling the insights of the woman who'd become his most trusted teacher? The tragedy lies in the historical fog surrounding her contributions. Unlike Pericles' speeches preserved on papyrus and stone, Aspasia's words survive only as echoes in male voices. Modern scholars dissect her possible influence like forensic linguists, noting how Pericles' arguments for immigration reform mirror her own status as a metic or foreign resident. His unprecedented acknowledgement of women's emotional labor in wartime, "Great is the glory of she whose sons show virtue," reads like an insider's perspective smuggled into patriarchal discourse. Even the structure of his speeches, blending logical rigor with emotional appeal, reflects a synthesis of traditionally masculine and feminine rhetorical styles that Athenian audiences would have found startling. Yet Aspasia's legacy transcends ancient politics. She represents every unnamed collaborator throughout history, the wives who edited manifestos, the sisters who debated theories over kitchen tables, the daughters whose ideas were absorbed into male relatives' work. Her ghost haunts disciplines from science to literature, reminding us that groundbreaking achievements rarely spring from solitary genius. When Marie Curie's lab notes glow with radioactivity or Rosalind Franklin's X-ray diffraction images reveal DNA structure, we're witnessing the same pattern. Marginalized minds illuminating truths that power structures struggle to acknowledge. The most poignant lesson from Aspasia isn't about lost speeches, it's about the cost of silencing. Athens, for all its democratic ideals, impoverished itself by excluding half its population from intellectual life. What breakthroughs in philosophy, mathematics, or governance died unborn because society refused to listen? Today, as we rediscover forgotten figures from Hypatia to Enheduanna, we're not just correcting the historical record. We're reclaiming the right to wonder about the books never written, the laws never proposed, the cures never discovered when brilliance is systematically suppressed. Aspasia's greatest gift may be the question she forces us to ask: whose voices are we still not hearing? Evening sunlight slanted through the Senate chamber's high windows as Cato the elder rose, clutching a single withered fig. The senators leaned in. They knew what was coming. For years, no speech of his ended without those 5 fateful words: Carthago delenda isti, Carthage must be destroyed. But this time, he didn't just say it. He slammed the fig onto the marble floor, its bruised flesh splitting open. This fruit was picked near Carthage 3 days ago, he declared. Our enemy isn't just surviving, they're thriving at our gates. With that theatrical stroke, Cato turned a rhetorical tick into an existential alarm bell, proving that obsession, when weaponized through repetition, can rewrite a nation's destiny. What made Cato's crusade so effective wasn't its logic. Carthage was already weakened by previous wars, but its psychological relentlessness. Like a drumbeat under every political debate, his refrain transformed a distant threat into an urgent mantra. Modern strategists might call it message discipline, but Cato elevated it to art. Whether discussing tax reforms or road repairs, he always circled back to Carthage. The brilliance and horror lay in how he exploited cognitive bias. The more frequently Romans heard the phrase, the more inevitable war seemed, regardless of facts. Today, when politicians hammer slogans into public consciousness or advertisers repeat taglines until they feel like truths, they're unwittingly using Cato's playbook. Yet the speech's darkest power emerged from its simplicity. Unlike Cicero's layered arguments or Caesar's charismatic appeals, Cato's message was brutally reductive. Complex trade rivalries and geopolitical balances distilled into 5 syllables, easy for any citizen to chant. This linguistic efficiency made opposition seem unpatriotic. After all, who would defend a city everyone agreed must be destroyed? A parallel to modern demonization campaigns, from witch hunts to xenophobic rallying cries, is unsettling. Cato proved that when you reduce a nuanced issue to a binary imperative, reason becomes collateral damage. The tragic irony: Rome didn't need to annihilate Carthage. The once mighty empire had been reduced to a compliant client state, its harbors emptied of warships, its treasury drained by reparations. But Cato's fixation created a self-fulfilling prophecy. When Carthage dared to defend itself against Numidian raids technically allowed under treaty terms, Rome pounced, interpreting survival as defiance. The resulting Third Punic War wasn't strategy, it was ritual slaughter. Legionaries spent 17 days demolishing the city brick by brick, sowing the earth with salt to ensure nothing would grow. The very excess of the destruction betrayed its irrational core. This wasn't about security, but about satisfying a narrative too often repeated to question. Cato's legacy whispers a warning through the ages. When Winston Churchill vowed to fight on the beaches or climate activists insist net zero is non-negotiable, they channel the same rhetorical force: repetition as conviction engine. The line between urgency and obsession blurs where catchphrases replace critical thought. Perhaps the most chilling lesson isn't that Cato's words burned Carthage, but that they first numbed Rome's conscience, one recitation at a time. The stones of Carthage didn't just collapse under Roman hammers, they crumbled under the weight of a phrase repeated until it felt like fate. The forum reeked of sweat and iron as Mark Antony ascended the rostrum, his hands still streaked with Caesar's blood. The crowd seethed, some mourning, others cheering Brutus tyrannicide. Antony didn't shout, he didn't brandish weapons. He unrolled Caesar's will like a fuse and lit it with 3 words: he was kind. What followed wasn't just a eulogy, it was a masterclass in emotional alchemy, turning a mob's fury into a political earthquake. Shakespeare's version captures the drama, but the real speech was far more surgical. Antony's genius lay in his restraint. He began by conceding Brutus' nobility. Brutus is an honorable man, repeating the phrase until its irony curdled in the air. Each time he listed one of Caesar's virtues: his refusal of the crown, his donations to Rome's poor. That hollow praise chipped away at the conspirators' justification. The crowd's murmurs grew louder as he revealed Caesar's will: gardens left to the people, gold for every citizen. This wasn't a tyrant's legacy, it was a benefactor's last act of love. By the time Antony lifted Caesar's bloodied robe, the fabric wasn't just a prop, it was a mirror forcing Rome to confront its own complicity. Modern psychologists would recognize Antony's tactics. He weaponized cognitive dissonance, forcing the crowd to reconcile their admiration for Brutus with the growing evidence of Caesar's generosity. His pauses weren't just theatrical, they were psychological pressure valves, allowing outrage to build between revelations. When he finally broke down, claiming his grief overwhelmed him, that calculated vulnerability turned the speech into a shared catharsis. Today, when politicians reference personal loss or activists share victim testimonies, they're tapping into the same primal dynamic. Facts persuade minds, but shared emotion mobilizes armies. Yet the speech's darkest brilliance was its plausible deniability. Antony never directly accused the conspirators. He merely wondered aloud if ambition truly deserved death, or if Caesar's wounds cried out for justice. This feigned humility gave him cover technically. He'd honored the Senate's amnesty agreement while dismantling it brick by brick. Modern spin doctors use this same sleight of hand, letting audiences connect the dots themselves to avoid accountability. The riot that followed wasn't just spontaneous, it was engineered through layers of implication, proving that the most dangerous words are often the ones left unsaid. Antony's legacy isn't just in the flames that consumed Brutus' reputation, but in the blueprint he left for turning grief into power. From martyrs' funerals galvanizing revolutions to viral eulogies reshaping public opinion, his playbook remains startlingly current. The tragedy, Caesar's blood bought Antony not loyalty, but a lesson he'd soon learn himself. Mobs raised by rhetoric are just as easily turned against their creators. In the end, his speech became its own cautionary tale about the price of awakening forces even the speaker can't control. Athens burned behind them as the refugees crowded the rocky shores of Salamis, their children clutching sacks of grain, their eyes fixed on the horizon where Persian sails darkened the sea. Themistocles stood before this desperate assembly, not with comforting lies, but with a terrifying gamble. Abandon your homes completely and stake everything on untested wooden warships. His words that day in 480 BC didn't just redirect a battle, they rewrote the rules of warfare itself. The walls of Athens are not stone, he declared, pointing to the triremes bobbing in the bay. They are there in those decks and oars. Trust the sea, and we will drown the invaders in their own hubris. What made this speech revolutionary wasn't its patriotism, it was its ruthless practicality. While other leaders urged last stands at the city gates, Themistocles framed retreat as strategic theater. He revealed his own secret gambit, the oracle of Delphi's cryptic prophecy about wooden walls saving Greece wasn't divine mystery. He'd manipulated its interpretation to prime Athens for this moment. The brilliance lay in his psychological maneuvering. By reframing ships not as weapons but as mobile fortresses, he turned naval warfare from desperation into destiny. Modern strategists still study this pivot, how Elon Musk framed Tesla's early struggles as necessary innovation, or how Churchill transformed Dunkirk's evacuation into a paradoxical victory. Themistocles proved that persuasion isn't about denying reality, but redefining what victory looks like. The stakes couldn't have been higher. Persia's King Xerxes watched from a golden throne ashore as his fleet of 1,200 ships outnumbered Greece's 300. But Themistocles exploited a fatal flaw in Persian psychology, their assumption that more ships meant inevitable triumph. His speech meticulously outlined how Salamis' narrow straits would negate Persia's numerical advantage, forcing their vessels to collide while Greek triremes darted like hornets. This wasn't optimism, it was physics disguised as rhetoric. When skeptical citizens cried, "We are not sailors," Themistocles countered with their own history. Nor were we marathon runners until we outran the Persians 10 years ago. The parallel was masterful. It transformed doubt into déjà vu, reminding Athens they defied odds before. Yet the speech's true power emerged in its emotional alchemy. Themistocles didn't downplay the sacrifice of abandoning Athens to flames, he weaponized it. "Let the Persians burn empty houses," he roared. "When they find no one to enslave, their victory will taste like ash." This reframing turned loss into leverage, making evacuation not a surrender but a trap. His crowning argument, a calculated whisper. "And when we return, we'll rebuild not just a city, but an empire." That vision of post-war dominance Athens as a naval superpower was the speech's secret engine. Like Steve Jobs selling the first iPhone not as a phone but as a revolution, Themistocles sold despair as the birth pangs of thalassocracy. The aftermath proved his words prophetic. The Battle of Salamis became history's first great naval upset, with Persia losing a third of its fleet to Greece's 40 ships. But Themistocles' deeper triumph was cultural. He'd shattered the Greek worldview that valued hoplite infantry over cowardly sea battles. Within decades, Athens' maritime empire funded the Parthenon and Plato's Academy, all birthed from that desperate gamble. The lesson echoes wherever innovation meets resistance. Uber convincing cities to rethink taxis, or scientists advocating mRNA vaccines during a pandemic. Themistocles taught us that the future often belongs to those who can articulate not just what is, but what could be, especially when the present seems most hopeless. His speech endures as a masterclass in crisis leadership precisely because it rejected easy comfort. No promises of safety, no guarantees, just a clear-eyed path through chaos for those brave enough to take it. When modern entrepreneurs pivot startups or climate activists demand radical energy transitions, they channel Themistocles' ethos. True security lies not in clinging to familiar shores, but in setting sail toward the storm. Flames guttered in the wind as Vercingetorix walked unarmed through the wreckage of Alesia, his bronze torque glinting against the grime of battle. The Gallic chieftain could have fled into the forests, died sword in hand, but his final act wasn't for his warriors. It was for history. When he knelt before Caesar in 52 BC, the speech that echoed across the silent camp wasn't a plea for mercy. It was a masterstroke of psychological judo, turning physical surrender into moral victory. "I fought not for glory," he declared, laying his weapons at the conqueror's feet, "but for the freedom my people could not win. Do with me as you will, but let this moment remind Rome that even its might cannot silence honor." What made these words unforgettable wasn't their defiance, but their calculated dignity. Vercingetorix knew Caesar needed spectacle, a barbarian king humiliated in chains to parade through Rome's streets. So he denied him the narrative. By embracing defeat with regal composure, he reframed the entire Gallic wars. No longer was this just Rome crushing rebels. It became a tragic clash between two noble visions. The genius lay in his subtext. Caesar might own Gaul's land, but Vercingetorix would own its memory. Modern revolutionaries from Gandhi to Mandela would later employ this same tactic, turning physical loss into symbolic resistance by controlling how their surrender was remembered. The speech's power also flowed from its cultural resonance. Celtic chieftains were judged by their generosity in victory and grace in defeat. Vercingetorix's invocation of his people's suffering, "The children who will never know our songs, the elders who trusted my shield," wasn't just pathos, it was a warrior's final duty. He bound his personal fate to Gaul's collective identity, ensuring that if Rome erased their independence, it could never erase their pride. Even Caesar, ever the propagandist, seemed unsettled. His own writings, which usually paint enemies as savages, concede Vercingetorix's nobility, proof that the Gaul's words had already begun rewriting history in real time. Yet the most striking aspect of this moment is its brutal irony. Vercingetorix's dignified surrender spared his warriors but sealed his own grotesque fate, 6 years imprisoned in a Roman dungeon before being ritually strangled during Caesar's triumph. But here's the twist. While Caesar's victory procession faded from memory, the image of the chieftain kneeling unbowed grew into legend. French revolutionaries resurrected him as a proto-nationalist. Romantic artists painted him gazing past his captors toward some unseen horizon. And even today, schoolchildren learn his name while Caesar's lieutenants gathered dust. This speech endures because it reveals an uncomfortable truth about power. Empires can win every battle and still lose the story. When Ukrainian soldiers on Snake Island told a Russian warship, "Go fuck yourselves," or when indigenous leaders today surrender ancestral lands with speeches about unbroken spirit, they're channeling Vercingetorix's playbook. Physical defeat is inevitable sometimes, but the right words, spoken at the right moment, can turn a conqueror's moment of glory into their lasting shame. The Gauls' final act proved that legacy isn't written by the victors alone. Sometimes it's etched by those who kneel with their heads unbent. The desert wind howled through Palmyra's colonnades as Zenobia mounted the palace steps, her purple cloak snapping like a battle standard. Rome's ultimatum lay crumpled in her fist: surrender or face annihilation. The year was 272, and this Syrian queen, ruling a glittering oasis empire between Rome and Persia, had just made history's most audacious counteroffer, not submission but partnership. The East and West should share this world as equals, she declared, her voice cutting through the dry air. In that moment, Zenobia didn't just reject Rome's dominance, she shattered the ancient world's most unbreakable assumption, that only men could challenge empires. What made Zenobia's defiance revolutionary wasn't just its boldness, but its meticulous preparation. Unlike other rebels who acted on raw passion, she'd spent years laying the groundwork for this confrontation. Fluent in Egyptian, Greek, and Latin, she positioned Palmyra not as a rogue state, but as Rome's logical counterpart, a cultured, multilingual power bridging continents. Her speeches cleverly echoed Roman virtues while subverting them. You honor strong leaders, then honor me. You value law. My codes protect merchants from Euphrates to Nile. This rhetorical jujutsu turned Rome's own ideals against it, making her seem less a rebel than a natural successor to Cleopatra and Dido. Modern leaders still use this tactic. When Taiwan frames itself as a guardian of traditional Chinese culture, or Silicon Valley startups adopt corporate jargon to disrupt industries, but Zenobia did it while wearing a diadem and commanding armies. The true brilliance of her stand lay in its theatrical timing. As Rome reeled from plague and civil war, Zenobia expanded her territory from Antioch to Alexandria, minting coins with her face beside the emperor's. Her proclamation of equality wasn't a desperate plea, it was a power move disguised as diplomacy. When Aurelian's legions finally marched east, they expected to crush another tribal uprising. Instead, they found cities fortified with Roman engineering, troops drilled in Roman tactics, and a queen who quoted Virgil better than most senators. Zenobia hadn't just rejected Rome's authority, she'd mirrored its strength back at it, forcing Aurelian to either acknowledge her legitimacy or admit his empire wasn't invincible. Yet the speech's tragic dimension reveals itself in hindsight. Zenobia's vision of parity might have worked a century earlier or later, but in the crisis-ridden 3rd century, Rome couldn't afford to share the stage. Her calculated gamble became a cautionary tale about the limits of hubris. When Palmyra fell after months of siege, legend says she fled on camelback, only to be captured at the Euphrates. The ending varies. Some say she poisoned herself like Cleopatra, others that she walked golden chains through Rome before retiring to a villa. What's undeniable is how thoroughly she inverted her defeat. Where other conquered rulers faded into oblivion, Zenobia's defiance grew larger in memory, transforming her from a failed rebel into a feminist icon centuries ahead of her time. Today, her legacy pulses wherever marginalized voices claim space at the table, from women demanding seats in boardrooms to small nations asserting sovereignty against superpowers. Zenobia's playbook endures. The lesson isn't just about courage, it's about crafting narratives so compelling that even in loss, you dictate how history remembers the fight. Her story asks the uncomfortable question: is it better to negotiate survival on your knees or risk everything for one moment of standing tall? Rome erased Palmyra from the maps, but couldn't erase the whisper that once a queen looked an empire in the eye and said, "I am your equal." That whisper still unsettles every throne. The sand of Syracuse was warm beneath Archimedes' diagrams when the Roman soldier's shadow fell across his geometric proofs. Even as the sword loomed, the old mathematician's hand never wavered. His stick continued tracing perfect curves in the dust. His legendary last words, "Do not disturb my circles," weren't just a scholar's absent-mindedness. They were the ultimate rebuke to brute force, a declaration that some truths transcend even survival. What makes this moment unforgettable isn't the apocryphal drama. Historians debate whether it actually happened, but what it represents about the human mind at its most luminous. Archimedes wasn't ignoring death, he was asserting priority. Those circles symbolized his life's work, calculating pi, proving sphere-to-cylinder ratios, inventing hydrostatics. To him, interrupting such discoveries was the greater violence. Modern scientists chasing breakthrough moments, from Einstein refining equations on his deathbed to Marie Curie keeping lab notes despite radiation burns, channel this same obsession. The irony, the soldier who killed him likely never grasped that Archimedes' war machines had delayed Rome's conquest for years. In the end, the greatest threat to empire wasn't his siege engines, but his refusal to acknowledge anything more important than truth. The speech's deeper brilliance lies in its layered meanings. On one level, it's about academic focus, the stereotype of professors lost in thought. But peel further, and it becomes a manifesto for intellectual sovereignty. Archimedes didn't plead for his life or curse his killer. He treated the interruption as the real crime. This inversion of values, equating a geometer's diagrams with a conqueror's destiny, strikes at civilization's central tension. Do we measure progress in territory taken or knowledge gained? When Alan Turing cracked Enigma only to be hounded for his sexuality, or when Soviet geneticists continued Mendel's work despite Lysenko's purges, they proved that Archimedes' defiance wasn't eccentricity, it's the quiet rebellion at science's core. Yet there's haunting symbolism in those circles. To Archimedes, they represented cosmic perfection. The pure forms Plato said governed reality. His final act was literally grounding philosophy in earth, as if to say even mortality couldn't distort eternal truths. Today, when astronomers map black holes or quantum physicists chart particle trails, they're still chasing his vision that the universe speaks in geometries we can decipher. The soldier saw meaningless scratches in sand. Archimedes saw the scaffolding of existence. That disconnect between how power and wisdom perceive worth still resonates wherever budgets slash basic research to fund immediate gains. The tragedy, of course, is that Rome eventually honored Archimedes more in death than Syracuse did in life. The general Marcellus, horrified by the killing, built him a tomb carved with his beloved sphere and cylinder diagram. It's a bittersweet lesson. Societies often cherish genius only after destroying it. But the real legacy isn't in marble memorials. It's in every stubborn act of curiosity that refuses to yield to practicality. When a child stays up late solving math puzzles or a researcher persists despite funding cuts, they're keeping Archimedes' circles undisturbed. His last words remind us that civilizations aren't remembered for their battles, but for what their minds dared to trace in the dust between them. Dawn mist clung to the Tiber River on October 28, 312, as Constantine's army stirred beneath a sky that shouldn't have held miracles. The night before, his scouts reported his rival Maxentius had twice as many troops guarding Rome's Milvian Bridge, until Constantine raised his eyes and saw it, a blazing cross superimposed on the sun, with words seared into his vision like divine graffiti. In hoc signo vinces, by this sign conquer. What followed wasn't just a battle speech, it was the moment a soldier's vision rewrote 1,200 years of Roman tradition, turning Jupiter's empire into Christ's dominion with 5 whispered words. Constantine's genius lay in his packaging of the supernatural. He didn't announce his vision as a private revelation. He framed it as tactical intelligence from the ultimate authority. The God of the Christians guarantees our victory, he told his men, but the subtext was clearer. This wasn't just another civil war skirmish. It was enrollment in a cosmic revolution. The brilliance of his rhetoric, it made faith actionable. By ordering his troops to paint Christ's Chi-Rho symbol on their shields, he transformed abstract devotion into a uniform, a team jersey for history's most consequential underdogs. Modern leaders still mimic this tactic, whether it's tech startups adopting cult-like mission statements or nations rallying around special destiny narratives. But Constantine did it with the stakes of eternal salvation hanging in the balance. The speech's power came from its perfect alignment of personal and collective interest. To pagan soldiers, Constantine emphasized the vision's military promise victory from a god who'd allegedly outmaneuvered all Rome's deities. To the growing Christian minority in his ranks, it was validation of their persecuted faith. This dual-channel messaging anticipated modern political spin by millennia. When his forces smashed through Maxentius' defenses, the rival emperor drowning in the Tiber under the weight of his own armor, the victory seemed less like battle luck and more like prophecy fulfilled. Yet the true revolution happened off the battlefield. Constantine's post-victory Edict of Milan didn't just tolerate Christianity. It positioned the faith as Rome's spiritual heir apparent. His rhetoric skillfully blended Christian themes with Roman values, portraying Christ not as a rebel against empire but as its ultimate benefactor. This rebranding exercise, what scholars now call political theology, allowed crucifixion symbols to adorn the same standards that had once nailed rebels to crosses. The irony was exquisite. A faith born resisting imperial power now sanctified it. What makes this moment resonate today isn't just its religious impact, but its lesson about narrative alchemy. Constantine proved that when you attach a higher purpose to practical goals, whether it's a CEO framing quarterly profits as innovation for human progress, or a general recasting invasion as liberation, you unlock irrational levels of commitment. The shadow of Milvian Bridge stretches from Joan of Arc's visions to modern conspiracy theories anywhere someone claims divine endorsement for earthly ambition. The chilling footnote, Constantine waited until his deathbed to officially convert, hedging his bets to the end. Even as he built churches and convened the Council of Nicaea, he kept one foot in the old pantheon, minting coins with Sol Invictus. This pragmatic duality, using faith as a tool while delaying personal commitment, reveals the speech's darker legacy. How easily spiritual fervor can be weaponized by those who view it as strategy rather than salvation. When the Chi-Rho emblazoned shields charged that day, they weren't just fighting for a god, they were drafting him into Rome's propaganda machine, setting a precedent that would haunt Christendom for centuries. Constantine's vision endures because it crystallizes civilization's central tension between the transformative power of belief and the corruption that follows when power co-opts transcendence. From presidential inaugurations invoking God's blessing to terrorists claiming martyrdom's reward, we're still wrestling with his discovery that nothing mobilizes humans like the conviction heaven itself is taking sides. The Milvian Bridge wasn't just where Rome converted to Christianity, it's where humanity learned that faith, when voiced by those holding swords, can redirect history's river into channels both glorious and